Hello. Welcome to Meltdown Festival. This is the Activism weekend, and this is the first time that a series of talks has been included in the festival, and it's something that Yoko Ono was very keen on having. My name's Olivia Solon, and I'm the associate editor of Wired.co.uk. Now, it goes without saying that web technologies have had a transformative impact on the way that we live our lives, allowing us to find people with shared interests and ideologies around the world. It's hard to think of a major protest or uprising from the last few years where social media hasn't played a critical role, be it the Arab Spring, the London riots, the anti-government protests in Turkey, and now in Brazil. It allows people to organize themselves and pool resources cheaply and efficiently. It also allows images and reports of abuse of power to be disseminated globally when traditional channels are being muzzled. However, it can also spread misinformation, and it can be used by the authorities to gather intelligence on activists. So, how central a role should social media play within activism? Why did Turkey's Prime Minister label social media as society's biggest menace? And have web technologies turned us into clicktivists? And is that a bad thing? So to help us navigate these issues today, we have an absolutely fantastic panel. To my right, we have Jamie Bartlett, who's the director of the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media at think tank Demos. To my left, my immediate left, we have David Babs, who's director of campaigning group 38 Degrees. And to my far left, we have Cory Doctorow, who's the author, journalist, and activist. So I'm going to start by inviting each of the panelists to say a few words over a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to ask a few of my own questions before opening it up to the floor. So, Jamie, if you could kick things off.
Thank you, and welcome, everybody. In February 2012, in Italy, at the time, for the rest of us who are not Italian, unknown blogger called Beppe Grillo was polling at around 5 to 6% in the Italian national polls. 12 months later, without having given a single interview to an Italian journalist or mainstream media outlet, not having taken any of the party funding that's available to parties fighting elections, he won 25% of the national vote and was the leader of the single biggest party in the country. Absolutely remarkable story. And I remember 2 weeks before the election blackout in Italy, speaking to British journalists about my report on Beppe Grillo, saying this guy was going to cause a bit of a storm. He was polling at that time at about 16% in the polls. And none of the journalists would listen to me. Lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons was that they just thought that no one was actually going to bother to vote for this sort of semi-unknown joke figure. And I wasn't convinced at all. I was trying to tell them that I actually thought that they were going to vote, and in quite substantial numbers. In fact, I remember saying that he was going to do better than the polls. A couple of people were slightly interested, and then, of course, when the election results came in, they all wanted to phone me, and I wanted to tell them where to stick it, but because I'm such a media whore, I ended up doing it anyway. But this is the story. So I first came across Beppe Grillo about 18 months ago, looking at his remarkable Facebook presence. I'd been doing Facebook polling of various far-right groups for about a year at that point, and I suddenly saw this guy, Beppe Grillo, who had 1 million Facebook friends. And a lot of my work is trying to work out the relationship between people that do stuff online and what they do offline in politics. And I thought, this is a fascinating guy. Who is it? I'd never even heard of him. So I ran a Facebook poll, and essentially what that means is when all these advertisers bombard you with these really annoying ads on your Facebook page based on things you've clicked and said and liked, I do the same. I target people but based on what they've said they like in politics. And I've done surveys of the English Defence League and the Front National in France. And I did one on Beppe Grillo. And it's an amazing way of collecting data, by the way, because in the space of about 3 weeks, I had 2,000 completed survey responses from fans of Beppe Grillo. And what I worked out was that he'd managed to accrue about 200,000 offline activists, people that were, yes, they liked him on Facebook, but they were meeting up every single week in about 400 cities across Italy to design their own local versions of his party, the Five Star Movement, his party's manifesto. And they were going out, knocking on doors, recruiting people to join. And crucially, when the elections were coming around, they were getting the vote out. They were mobilizing the vote. Now, there's lots of reasons why it was Italy that Beppe Grillo first came about, not least a technocratic government and a lunatic who controls large proportions of the media. Now, it's a very easy target for Beppe Grillo to be an anti-establishment politician in Italy. It works very well. But it's the medium that I think made him turn the apathy in Italy into a political movement that has completely changed the face of politics there. Now, Beppe Grillo says that political parties are dead. People don't want to sign up every year and give £200 or whatever it is to be a member of a political party that tries to coalesce all these different views into one sort of coordinated movement. That's not really how people live their lives anymore. And he said we don't need parties anymore. We can have movements and we can coordinate it online, just like I did for the Italian elections. Now, actually, if you look, just to quickly look over to closer to home, in 1950, the Conservative Party had 3 million members. 3 million members, and these were the people that were holding raffles, organising fundraisers, and crucially, giving money and going out to knock on doors and leaflet when the elections came around. Do you know how many members there are of the Conservative Party now? It's under 100,000. But do you know how many unique Twitter followers members of Parliament from the Conservatives have, not including the leaders, and uniquely counted, so not double counted, who only follow Conservative MPs? It's over 300,000. And this is my sort of prediction for how mobilising those people is going to work in future. In a time when electoral turnout is falling, and it is falling across Europe, at the moment it's possibly going to go up again, actually, given how bad things are and how frustrated people are. But the general trend, especially among young people, has been down on electoral turnout. But interest in politics remains the same. In fact, it's probably going up among young people. But they're doing it in different ways. And I think for the political parties in this country, it's going to be about mobilising the vote. And it's going to be about mobilising the vote using social media. Not to tell someone to pay 50 quid a year to sign up and receive a leaflet, but can you, in this marginal constituency, for this 3-week period, can you get our vote out for us? Are you going to work with us? And I think that's going to be the crucial sort of the way in which formal political parties are going to try to work. But what this all does for me is it levels the playing field a little bit. It makes new upstart political movements, new renegade political movements, who don't have the huge machinery of the established parties. It gives them a bit of a fairer chance. And it was exactly what happened in Bradford with George Galloway. As he said, almost paraphrasing Beppe Grillo, sort of our head is on the internet, but our feet are on the ground. I use social media to mobilise my people. There's all these young people out there who are interested in politics, and I can get to them this way. I don't need a huge party to do it. I've got another way of speaking to them directly. And I think the future belongs to the parties that are going to be able to do that. But my final word is one of warning, and I always sort of come back to this. Demos, my think tank, was set up because people were disenfranchised and upset about politics and wanted new ways of connecting politics to their lives. And we had to find new ways of bringing them in. And this is brilliant. And this is a fantastic way of doing that. And yet there are still, of course, 8 million people who aren't on the internet in this country. And the one thing that I'm always worried about is that politics becomes even more dominated by a small clique of Westminster Twitter users and Facebook users and PR companies who see this as a brand new space to push certain agendas. So absolutely fundamental to all of this is to maintain that space as being one where people can convene, they can coordinate, they can mobilise, but never forgetting all of those people that aren't there as well. Because there's nothing would be worse in my mind than creating some sort of ghastly twitocracy of the same people controlling everything online rather than offline.
Thank you. Right, over to you, David.
Great, thank you. Can I start by just checking, how many people have come across 38 Degrees? Okay, I'll kind of do the explaining who we are a bit more quickly because of that. So 38 Degrees is a community of just over 1.5 million UK citizens who use the internet to do politics, and activism in the broader sense. So it's about coming together to try and influence decisions and decision makers that affect our lives. We use the internet to decide what issues we want to work on through conversations on Facebook, on our blog, through polls that are hosted on our website. And then we use the internet to coordinate action. So to do everything from create and sign petitions, contact members of parliament or chief executives of companies, through to organising events in our local area and letting people know about them. I guess what we're probably best known for are big coordinated online campaigns targeting the Westminster government, things like a successful campaign to stop Britain's forests being sold off, or a lot of work that we've done around challenging the government's changes to the NHS. But we are also increasingly present in local communities as well. We've got hundreds now of local groups doing everything from running local Save Our NHS campaigns through to organising film clubs and book clubs, which I think is a particularly interesting part of it, this kind of yearning for the social and seeing 38 Degrees as a way of meeting people who feel a bit like you in your area. I'm going to throw out a few things I think the example of 38 Degrees tells us about the internet and politics in the UK, which then we can chat and people can disagree with. The first is I think it disproves, it kind of agrees with Jamie's point, it disproves this political class narrative that party membership, participation in elections are declining because people are apathetic, because they don't care. We've seen 38 Degrees go from no members to 1.5 million members in just 4 years. We've got a different definition of membership to a political party, and that's something we could explore, but that's more members than all the political parties put together. It's more Twitter followers than all the political parties put together. People are switching off traditional party politics, traditional institutions, traditional ways of getting involved, but that appetite is there, and those members are active, and 2/3 of them are telling us that this is either the first time they've ever done something like this, the first time they've ever got involved in political stuff, or their first time for a really long time. Maybe they went on the march against the invasion of Iraq and then gave up for 10 years. Maybe they were involved in stuff in the 70s, but you know, these are new people. The second thing that I think 38 Degrees demonstrates is that in a UK context, the internet can serve as a powerful tool for getting people involved, but in a way that draws a lot on much older traditions of organising. So we see 38 Degrees as a mixture of old-fashioned community organising, the kind of stuff that was happening in community halls, in upstairs rooms of pubs, in church halls for decades, centuries. It's a mixture of that and digital, which means that the kind of logistical constraints that community organisers often face of how big the room is and how many people can get there can be broken down. So it's a mixture of the old and new, but what it means is that people are now able to pool their resources very rapidly and to scale using the internet. But the ways that we pool resources, the things that we're pooling and the activism that we take often isn't that unique. So petitions aren't new, visits to MPs aren't new, book clubs aren't new, but doing those things using the internet makes them happen at a scale and a speed that otherwise wouldn't happen. I think the third thing that's been really significant for 38 Degrees that's very much to do with social media and how social media works is the fluidity by which messages can spread and by which 38 Degrees members can tell other people about the work that they're involved in. So I've been an activist for ages, probably a lot of you have as well, and my experience for a lot of that time has been I've had my activist friends and my normal friends. Does that kind of resonate with anyone? Yeah, a few people are nodding. And you know, so activism, I think, at its best, if you take it back to its roots, it comes out of social relationships that have another part in your life. They're to do with your workplace, your community, where you live, people you're friends with anyway. But what I think increasingly happened, probably since the 70s, with changes to the economy, changes to the way we live our lives, is that activism became increasingly deracinated. Those social relationships that underpin the best activism increasingly broke down. So you ended up kind of having relationships that you'd forged through doing political stuff, and then the people that you knew in other ways. And what things like Facebook and Twitter allow 38 Degrees members to do is share things in a non-invasive way with everyone. And that breaks down that activist, non-activist divide and has allowed, I think that's been really crucial to the way that so many people who don't think of themselves as activists, don't think of themselves as political, but care about stuff and have values, have found themselves getting involved in 38 Degrees. So I think all that adds up to a really important role for the internet in how 38 Degrees has developed and how politics can change over the next few years and decades. It's really early to say how transformative all that will be. Obviously, thus far, the development of the internet hasn't coincided with great social and political transformations of the kind that maybe lots of us would hope for. But then 30 years on from the development of the printing press, that hadn't happened as well. Yet in the longer run, the printing press had a huge impact. I think I'm cautiously optimistic that overall the internet is, as Jamie described, lowering the barriers to entry for new players, for people who want to challenge established sources of power, and is kind of leveling the playing field a bit between citizens and those that seek to govern them or seek to control them. But it's early days, and it's always going to be a cat and mouse game. And it'll be really interesting to hear your thoughts as to how that cat and mouse game should develop.
Thank you.
So we have a project we've been undertaking for longer than we've been human, and that's figuring out how to work together, right? The origin of our species is in primate ancestors who decided to divide labor. You know, I'll look after the kids, you'll look for tigers, and that one will go get the fruit. And since that time, our project has involved figuring out how to minimize the amount of coordination we have to do so we can maximize the amount of work we do together. And, you know, this is at the core of every institution. Ronald Coase won the Nobel Prize in Economics after writing a paper in 1937 called The Theory of the Firm that said that the difference between any two institutions, churches, companies, crime syndicates, families, was mostly not in what they were trying to do, but how they coordinated efforts, how they stopped people from working across purposes or doing redundant work or what have you. By definition, the establishment is a collective of people who have worked out how to overcome difficult organizational challenges to get stuff done. That's what it means to be the establishment, is to be organized, right? Is to be running things. And what the internet does for the establishment is it makes it easier to run things because you realize the efficiencies of communications technology. But everybody else is actually in a position where they have something like no ability to coordinate, or a much higher price of coordination, or a much worse ratio of total energy or assets to action than the establishment. They have less to begin with, so they have to spend a bigger proportion of what they have to stay on target, right? If you're a career politician, you spend 8+ hours a day being a politician. If you're someone who's merely interested in politics, you spend 8 hours a day doing your job and then squeeze a few hours in here and there. So it's a different picture. When you give people who aren't in the establishment access to coordination technology, they go through a phase change, right? It's not a change in degree, it's a change in kind. When I was an activist in Toronto in the 1980s, 98% of my job consisted of stuffing envelopes and writing addresses on them, and 2% consisted of figuring out what to put in the envelopes, right? We get that free now, and that is a massive game-changing thing that has arisen as a consequence of communications technology. And I would put it to you that social media is too loosely defined to be a useful phrase here, and would just say internet technology as a better proxy for that. There is a critique, though, of contemporary online-driven activism that sneers at it and calls it Clicktivism, and says that what you have, the roots of activism, is a kind of inchoate itch that says things aren't right and I must do something. And that if you give people an easy way to do something, they fall prey to what you might call the security syllogism. Something must be done. I have done something. Something has been done. Right? And so there's this theory that if you give people too easy an out, right? You know that there's something wrong. There's a homeless person down your corner. There's problems in your workplace. There's a war going on you don't agree with, but you've ticked a box saying you don't agree with it, and now you can wash your hands of it, and that people will walk away from it. And that's probably true. There are probably people who do that. But here's my experience of activism coming from a multi-generational activist family, which is that for most activists, there's a period of activism that correlates loosely to when you're a student, when you can essentially pursue activism almost full-time. And then afterwards, activism becomes something that you rarely or never do because there isn't a smooth gradient of activities that you can use to engage and disengage from activism. And particularly where activism goes on, it tends to be either people who have nothing to lose, right? You drop out entirely, you live in a squat, you become a freegan, and your life becomes politics, or people who can afford to lose something, which is why activist circles tend to be pretty blokey, and in particular, why they don't appear, why mothers in particular are underrepresented in activist circles, because even in my feminist family of Marxist activists, my mom ended up doing more of the child care than my dad. And so when there was a demo on Saturday, it was more likely my mom who was running us around to whatever it was the kids had to do than my dad, because my dad was off doing the protest thing. When people sneer at Clicktivism, they're essentially saying that they have a theory of change that involves only those with nothing to lose or those who can afford to lose something. And it is a horrifically privileged point of view to come from. My view is that if you want to get people into the church, you have to have the Salvation Army out front beating the drum. That if you want people to take a step, the smaller that step is, the greater the likelihood that they'll take it. I would any day as a lifelong activist organizer have a first affirmative step that you can take in 5 minutes as a means of luring you into taking a greater step that takes 10 minutes and then an hour and then a day and then your life. Then start with, you must give up a whole Saturday and risk being kettled in order to take any affirmative step at all to becoming an activist.
Thank you. Well, that was a great point.
Thanks.
And I wanted to pick up on that with Jamie and David. I mean, do you think that Clicktivism is a sort of gateway drug for like more, perhaps more committed activism, or is it unfair even using the term in a pejorative way?
In my work, specifically on Facebook groups, those people that had liked things on Facebook were using it as a bridge into other ways of doing things. I mean, they were disproportionately likely to vote. They were disproportionately likely, compared to the national averages, to get involved in a demonstration, civil disobedience, and they used it as a way of coordinating those activities. I think the problem for many governments, and I'm sort of old-fashioned, I suppose, in the sense that the state as an expression of the collective will, a democratically accountable government is still obviously so close to my heart, and there are some threats to that, I think, with some types of social media activism, is that governments don't always know quite how much support there is behind the numbers they see on a screen. So I'll give you an example of when the English Defence League, because this is also used by groups that we might not like very much in exactly the same way, and in fact they're usually the best, they're some of the first people to pick it up because they think the mainstream establishment doesn't give them the opportunity to express themselves, so we'll try it another way. So the English Defence League, when they first turned up, had 100,000 Facebook friends within about 6 months of their first demonstration in 2009. And what they were doing was going to local authorities and saying to them, we have 100,000 Facebook friends, and if you grant planning permission to that mosque that's being proposed, I'm going to get 50,000 of them to come into your city centre every single week until you revoke it. And the local authorities weren't quite sure what 100,000 Facebook friends really meant. And they were consistently, massively over-policing the demonstrations because there was so much online buzz, and then only a couple of thousand people, at the most, usually about 300, would actually turn up. And that gets even more difficult when people create fake accounts, when they create multiple accounts and try to inflate numbers. So I think we have a bigger problem at the moment of how it is that the government and other institutions look at these numbers and work out what expression of public opinion is this? How legitimate is this as a form of expression?
I think Corey's made a more eloquent critique of the elitism inherent in attacks on Clicktivism than I've heard before. It was great. I think there are some other reasons why the Clicktivism critique is unhelpful, though. One is I don't think it's just about the fact that doing a little can lead to other things. I think doing a little is valuable in itself, especially if lots of people do it. And we've seen with 38 Degrees, hundreds of thousands of people signing petitions, donating a tenner, emailing their MP, can change government policy, can stop national assets being privatised. And that's valuable in itself and is something that people should be... It should be celebrated not just because it could lead to more, but because it can actually do good. I think really one of the challenges that the establishment has in looking at at people's new modes of participation is the kind of solipsism of the political class. Really, they can't believe that things aren't being organised from within the political class themselves. So when they see large numbers of people participating in things from somewhere, they think they must be being directed by some sinister force which ultimately stems back to them. So in the case of 38 Degrees, the Conservative Party generally assumes that we're a front group for the Labour Party. The Labour Party generally assumes we're a front group for the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats, they think either we're Labour or Conservative, which I think suggests that we're getting it right in terms of political independence. But I think it tells a story about how the politicians just haven't got their heads around this idea that people can self-organise and can in significant numbers. I think that, as well as that, there are just inevitable stresses and strains as new forms of political expression emerge. And some of them are problematic. Some of them probably are actually quite healthy. I think a healthy democracy will always involve quite a high degree of chaos, of different actors, of different agents competing for space. And that's what makes a democracy vibrant. You need civil society as well as formal politics.
So I remember when there was the protests against SOPA in the US, the Stop Online Piracy Act, and a lot of the kind of activism was taking place online, and there was quite a famous one-liner from someone in Congress who remarked, why can't they just hire lobbyists like everyone else? Which to me, demonstrated a complete misunderstanding of this new type of activism. And obviously we have people like Beppe, Grillo, we have the Pirate Party, we have the Occupy movement. But I wanted to ask you, how do these new types of activists, new type of activism kind of interface with the establishment? And maybe I'll start with Corey on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there has always been a kind of multiplier effect in the minds of elected representatives, well, and corporate executives and so on, when they receive feedback from the public, and they would say, a forum letter is worth is a proxy for so many people out there, and a call is a proxy for so many more, and a handwritten letter is a proxy for so many more than that. And that calculus is based on the amount of energy it takes to produce a signature or to collect a signature or to incentivize someone to put a signature down. And so their guidelines are based on kind of coordination efforts. So it's natural that as coordinating becomes easier, there will be inflation in the perception of how many people a signature is a proxy for, because it's right. They're absolutely right. It took more energy to get a signature on a petition 10 years ago than it did to get one now. And so a signature on a petition was probably a proxy for more people 10 years ago than it was now. And eventually may even get to a one-to-one correspondence where a petition is a person and no more and no less, right? 100,000 people just represent 100,000 people. We don't know. And it's case by case, as you've heard. Sometimes 100,000 people really is 100,000 people, maybe with the EDF, because of course, people whose communications have been historically suppressed in the mainstream are the early adopters of new technology, We have this weird narrative that pornographers are technophiles because the new technology is always adopted first by pornographers, and that there's some kind of weird connection between sex and technology. But there isn't, of course. The reason pornographers jump on new technologies is because they come from a space of highly regulated communications, and everybody, including pornographers who come from spaces of highly regulated communications, seeks less regulated fora for communications to move into. And so it's pornographers and the EDF and radicals and everyone who's not allowed to talk in the public in the way that they would like to is always looking for a new place. That's why 12-year-olds are overrepresented on message boards too, right? Not because they're technophiles particularly. I wanted to say about SOPA that what you said about the parties assuming that 38 degrees is always is a front for someone else really chimes with me. So I was in D.C. the week before the SOPA hearings, and you'll know that SOPA was this day none of your kids could do their homework last year because Wikipedia went black because of this horrible American copyright proposal called SOPA. And the way that SOPA unfolded, so I was in D.C. and I spoke to all these Hill insiders, and they all said, you know, forget about it. You can't make a change here. They've counted the votes, right? The people who depend on the entertainment industry to get reelected have been given their marching orders. If they don't vote SOPA up, they're not getting funded in the next campaign. They're all out of a job. You can't win this. Go home, figure out what you're going to do about a world where SOPA is the law, not what to do about stopping SOPA from becoming the law. But a relatively small group of activists, the 4 activists at Fight for the Future, the 2 lead activists at Demand Progress, built a set of tools where if you had a website, you could just drop a line of code in it, and when people came and visited it would black out your website and say, hey there, you know, there's this crazy law called SOPA you might have heard about. I'm going to have to shut down my website if it passes. If you tell me what your postcode is, your zip code, I'll tell you who your lawmakers are, where they stand on it, and I'll let you, with a button, make a phone call over your computer using voice over IP like Skype directly into Congress's switchboard, and you can ask to speak to your lawmaker, right? And in the space of a few days, they put 8 million phone calls through to Congress. And the congressman responsible worked out that as hard as it is to get reelected without campaign funding, it's much harder to get reelected without votes. And some of the sponsors of SOPA actually started denouncing it, right? They couldn't, the rats could not desert that ship fast enough. But the overarching narrative on the Hill today, especially from lobbyists from the entertainment companies, Chris Dodd being the head of the Motion Picture Association and a former senator who's on over $1 million a year representing the movie companies he used to regulate, is that it was Google, right? Google did it. And in fact, the story goes like this. People like me who knew a lot of senior Googlers spent all day, every day, in the run-up to Google actually doing this, calling them and saying, please, take some action. This is about you too. And them saying, our lobbyists are telling us that we need to play the Hill game. And at a certain point, after 8 million phone calls went through to Congress, Google joined. Right? It was the other way around. But that narrative is very hard to hammer through the heads of the establishment, which gives me hope, because for now, they are defending on the wrong flank, which is great for us.
Jamie, I wanted to ask you on the same issue.
Yeah. Well, it's always been the case, I suppose, that the most motivated people always make the most noise, do the most stuff, and have a disproportionate amount of influence. And that's even down to people that vote, because a lot of people don't even bother voting, so the voters have a disproportionate amount of influence. So nothing's changed there, and I guess it's a sort of force multiplier of that long tradition. It's always important for, especially in a representative democracy, to have good flows of information from opinion polling, the early days of Gallup and Pew and all the rest, up to now, and I think you're absolutely right, Corey, not quite knowing what to make of some of this in terms of how good it is as a source of information and insight into what the public's really thinking. And partly that's technology being difficult for some of these guys to understand, and partly it's just not being sure how the whole system works. But there's a really good example of Douglas Carswell, who's a bit of a renegade Tory right-wing MP, who says that this Parliament has been the most rebellious since the war. And he puts that down to the fact that MPs are increasingly getting much more pressure on social media from their constituents than they used to. It used to be a weekly session. sitting down at what was called the surgery where you'd see a line of 20 people having cups of tea and get some phone calls as well. Now you're being bombarded with information and campaigns all the time, and the MPs are looking down rather than up because they're most worried about getting re-elected. And I think that is a really good thing. I mean, that's absolutely as it should be. And so this is a really decent way to increase sort of constituents' voices through the period of Parliament and making the MPs look at them rather than at their careers.
How does it work with you? I mean, you put together a huge online petition, and how do you find your style of lobbying is received on the kind of government end?
I would say, I think it varies. Douglas Carswell, for example, talks quite favourably about the impact of organisations like 38 Degrees. But overall, MPs absolutely hate us, and that's not to do with any particular political party or any particular ideology. To be honest, my perception of the vast majority of MPs is they'd rather hear less from their voters, not more. And they didn't get into Parliament to spend time, waste time, and lots of them accuse us of wasting their time by enabling their voters to get in touch with them. That's included one MP reporting us to the Information Commissioner for violating his privacy by making his parliamentary email address available to his constituents.
Can you tell us who that was?
Yeah, Dominic Raab, Esher and Walton. Another MP, Julian Lewis, he's just got rid of his email address altogether. Good luck if you're in the New Forest and want to email your MP. He's just got rid of it. There too, they're of the bolder examples, but overall, it's not something that's welcome to MPs. And they often accuse 38 Degrees and other organisations who deliver mass mobilisations of being counterproductive. It's like, well, I'm much less likely to do this now because you've annoyed me so much. Does that correlate though with it being ineffective? I don't think so. I think what it tells us is just that that there is going to be a degree of confrontation when citizens seek power from the powerful. That's not to say any confrontation is good and that it's impossible to be counterproductive. But to give you an anecdote from the pre-internet age, I was working at Friends of the Earth, running the mobilisation for what's now the Climate Change Act, a successful effort to shift MPs into a position where they supported legislation to set targets for reducing emissions. And I live in Hackney, and the local Friends of the Earth group there was having trouble with Diane Abbott's MP. She was saying it wasn't something that was a priority for her constituents. She didn't think it was worth doing. And because I lived there, I got quite involved with their efforts to change her mind, which involved getting hundreds and hundreds of postcards delivered to her. That pushed her into agreeing to appear at a public meeting in a community hall in Stoke Newington, where we packed it, standing room only. And by the end of that meeting, she turned to me, I was chairing it on behalf of Friends of the Earth, and said, just to be very clear to everyone here, whatever he tells me to do in Parliament to help this pass, I will do it. Which was fantastic. So when we won, I thought, brilliant, let's make a video for all the activists around the country to reflect this back to them, how powerful their impact was. I know Diane Abbott would be a great case study in that. We really, I visibly saw her move in this way. So down in her office with a camera pointing at her, Diane, could you just explain the way that people helped convince you to support this law? And she looked the camera in the eye and she said, I've always believed that climate change is a really important issue and I was always going to do this.
Was it then followed by a wink?
It's the moral of the story. They lied.
I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. I'm sure there's lots of questions. But it feels as though, in some cases, the very companies whose services are being used to promote activist movements, Google, Facebook, Twitter, are increasingly becoming targeted by activists for things like privacy infringement and tax evasion. And I wanted to ask whether activists should be looking to use alternative tools. And I want to start with Corey on that one.
Yeah. I think that there's a variety of reasons that you might be suspicious of the companies that connect you to the internet and the companies that you connect to on the internet. And they range from things like tax evasion, which I'm concerned about as a citizen, but I don't think is likely to lead them, for example, into ratting you out to the Prime Minister of Turkey. So depending on, I think that from an organizing perspective, you need to be clear on what your threat model is. You need to be clear about what you're worried about and how you're going to secure yourself against it by making good choices and using the right technology. Tax evasion, as bad as it is not likely to lead a company down the wrong path. On the other hand, being committed to having a sales office in a particular country, if that's what their business model is, means that they will necessarily be in that jurisdiction. Their competitive pressures are really important. There was a long time when you could get Google to do anything stupid by making Yahoo do it first. And so that's how Google ended up in China. And it lasted until two things happened. One was Yahoo became no longer any kind of competitor of Google's in any meaningful way. And the Chinese hacked Google through the back door that the American government had mandated they put in to help them intercept email of people they wanted to keep an eye on. I think, in particular, the one system that we should all be very, very worried about in terms of how it fails is Facebook. Facebook, I mean, in addition to being a Skinner box that systematically teaches you to undervalue your privacy, Facebook is also not on the internet. You get to it using the internet, but it's not on the internet, which means that if Facebook deletes your whole group, it won't have been cached and archived automatically by all those things that cache and archive the internet. So it fails incredibly poorly. If you're going to design an activist campaign whose main constituents are all on Facebook, your campaign should be about reaching out to them through Facebook and getting them to go do something activist off Facebook, because Facebook has shown itself willing, for reasons that have nothing to do with politics and everything to do with its business model, to shut down or make harder the job of a group to remain cohesive within it. For example, one of its business models is that if you have a bunch of people who've liked your cause, they charge you money to reach them. And that price goes up and down variably. So you don't just have an address book of people you can send an email to. You've just got a kind of black hole that you send messages to at Facebook, and Facebook decides whether or not to deliver your messages out of that black hole, and sometimes presents you with a bill for it. And presumably, the more you need Facebook, the higher that bill is going to be.
Well, Jamie, you were saying that you use Facebook quite a lot to do polls of political movements. I mean, where do you
don't get off Facebook, because I won't have anyone to poll. But I mean, they're obviously large corporate organisations with the same pressures as a lot of them, and especially when it comes to things like internet. So, I mean, modern surveillance by governments depends on cooperation with big internet service providers, and they will ultimately work with them because there's a business case for doing it. Lawful access is always going to be an important part of that. But at the same time, the newspapers, the Guardian or the Times, also have corporate interests and corporate pressures, and you wouldn't not want to go and work with them as a result. I mean, if you've got hundreds of thousands of people that you can reach on Facebook, or key journalists that you work with on Twitter, you're going to go there and do it. I mean, but it's ultimately a decision for each person, isn't it?
In lots of ways, this dilemma isn't new to the internet. It's in the same way that a community group campaigning against the council doing something rubbish might well rely on a council-owned building as their meeting space, and that introduces its own tensions. I think it's something that activists need to be mindful of, but also pragmatic about. There is a value in getting into the spaces that people already are and reaching them there. There are two things that I guess 38 Degrees tries to do to mitigate the risks. One is not depend exclusively on any one fora, and so we are present on Facebook. Facebook's agenda is to force people to give it money, not to provide a forum for public debate. It's one of these quasi-public spaces, just like lots of shopping centres all over the UK, or all kinds of spaces around here. And that means it will there's a cat and mouse game. You're continually trying to hack the way it sets up things so you can reach more people, and it's trying to shut that down and marketise it. But we wouldn't, at the same time, we rely very heavily on email because that's something that's got very different characteristics and enables us to be free. I think overall, the benefits of engaging pragmatically with all the mainstream forums where people are outweigh the downsides, but you have to go into it with your eyes open and not get too dependent on any one.
I mean, you have seen, by the way, very quickly that people have, over the last 3 or 4 years, especially on Facebook, have started upping their privacy settings. That's been quite a consistent trend. God knows how much more that's going to be the case now after the Prism story and also the communications data bill, and just a lot of stories seemingly coming out about this. I'm pretty sure you're going to see more and more people using various anonymous browsers, shutting down from Facebook and other big organizations. And there's a downside to that as well. There are good reasons to be sharing lots of information. It is actually a really useful tool for a lot of people. So I'm slightly worried about some of those trends too.
So can I just add one thing? That there's the same critique of Clicktivism also predicts that totalitarian states or states that are in challenge will shut down their internet when it becomes a problem. And so before the Arab Spring, the closest example we had was Burma, where during the Burmese uprising, the actual junta kept the net going for a whole week, during which every day the likelihood of Western intervention went up. And they did because that country really has one source of income, and it's a giant oil company that would cease to be able to function if they cut off the internet. And so the internet stayed live. Turkey didn't shut down the internet and still hasn't shut down the internet, despite all the saber rattling and calling Twitter the greatest threat to Turkish democracy since I don't know what. But in the Arab Spring they did, and I think what we're seeing is that increasingly countries that are industrialized, if shutting down the internet is essentially it's a self-destruct mechanism. It's not a last-ditch attempt to save yourself. It's taking everything down at the same time because the state ceases to operate when it takes down the internet.
Sorry, I didn't mention the second thing that 38 Degrees is doing that, which is campaigning against laws which make that situation worse. For example, Jamie just mentioned the communications data bill, which things like that, like SOPA, using the tools we have, but recognizing that the internet as a space where we can organize is something that is contingent on governments not being given too much power over it, and organizing to defend our freedom to organize on the internet is a really important thing. And it looks like there's going to be a revival of some of the more nefarious bits of the communications data bill using the Woolwich attacks as an excuse. So that's something that we'll have to. We thought we'd won that campaign. We'll have to run it again now.
Okay, so who's got a question? I'm going to start with you in the middle. Oh, hang on, just wait for the microphone.
In terms of movements, what is the optimum mix between on and offline, if you can answer that? In other words, you've talked a lot about how social media can be used to very quickly mobilize people. Does that mean that there is no more need for getting together in the room up above the pub? Or can it all now take place online? And that's, if anyone has anything to say to that, that's for anybody.
So a few weeks ago, the government published some proposed regulations which around the new GP commissioning within the NHS, which would essentially, 38 Degrees members online clubbed together to pay for lawyers to do an analysis of those regulations. It became clear that they would basically force privatisation very rapidly. We launched on the Monday a petition against those regulations. The same Friday, 38 Degrees members living in Lib Dem constituencies went down to in all bar one Lib Dem backbenchers that Friday, holding constituency surgeries in their local area, were visited by a delegation of 38 Degrees members with a copy of that petition, and was delivered to them. And I think that's the perfect circle, really. You're using the internet to pull resources to get the information you need, to get large numbers, but then also to organise in a local area. And that meant that those people going to visit their MPs, both they'd organised using the internet, but they were also empowered by the fact they knew 200,000 people were standing behind them, and they were speaking on behalf of all those people as they went to see their MP. I think. So it's not either or, it's like the more you can of both. And exactly how that elaborates itself will depend on the campaign timelines, on the campaign objective and target. But it's not one or the other. It's best when both are really integrated and are pushing in the same direction.
Jamie, I think you had some interesting stats on the number of people who signed up for petitions and then the number of people who actually turned up at protests.
Yeah, I mean, it varies according to the group, but just to say a percentage, if I had to, so it was about between 20 and 30% of people that are part of political movements and groups are also willing and or do get involved in offline demonstrations of one type or another. The good thing about demonstrations on the streets is that it drives mainstream media coverage. That's the thing. So Beppe Grillo had 1 million fans, but the most important thing he did was fill every single piazza in every single city that he went to, while Berlusconi's were only half full. Gave a sense of momentum, got more media coverage, got more people interested in him, and so that's also what the English Defence League does. It only takes 200 of them on the street, and then normally about 500 counter demonstrators, and it's a big news story, and then they get more Facebook fans because everyone's suddenly interested in them. So they're quite smart, and a lot of these groups are quite smart in the way that they realise you don't need that many to coordinate enough people to get essentially free media, like incredibly expensive free advertising. But for Beppe Grillo, what was crucial was making sure that they did go on Facebook, but then they met offline, as you said, sorry, not offline, on the internet, on what were called meetup groups. And that again was vital, because all the work that we've ever done on voter turnout shows that telephone calls don't really work that well, letters and leaflets less well still. Nothing's better than knocking on the door and asking people to vote. And so his key was really making sure there was enough people in each town that were going to be able to knock on enough doors to mobilize people that weren't part of the group as well.
So I think the word here that's problematic is optimum, because you have to say optimum for what. But for example, if knocking on doors is the most highly correlated, which is to say that for every door knocker you get a half a vote, every 2 door knockers produces 1 vote. And for every phone call you get a 1/10 of a vote, but a phone call is 1,000th as easy to organize as a door knocker, then phone calls are optimum, right? In my last science fiction novel, Homeland, it revolves in part around an alternative political campaign by someone who doesn't want to get embroiled in campaign finance from entrenched interests. And so I wrote around to activists I knew who'd organized online campaigning stuff and said, what would you do if you had kind of a green field and you could organize one of these? And a lot of the people I knew who worked in the kind of the traditional electoral organizing space had nothing for me. It was all really kind of inside the box, inside the beltway. But I wrote to Aaron Swartz, who's a friend of mine who died last year, and Aaron sent me, I thought he would send me like some bullet points, but like an hour later he fired back like shovel-ready plans for designing a thing he called a machine for getting votes that I pasted straight into the book, except for the last gonna go build this now. And the last code he checked in before he killed himself last January after being hounded by the US attorney was code on this project. And he described a system for doing the best of both worlds, figuring out who you knew, figuring out who the people who were supporters knew who weren't yet supporters but were likely to be supporters, and tasking those individuals to individually reach out to those supporters, and then using automated note comparison to see whether or not this pitch or that pitch was more effective, and sharing that information in real time across the group. And I think that's kind of where the future of this stuff might end up, is a hybrid of personal relationships that involve an offline component, but a networked approach that involves figuring out how to make best use of that precious face-to-face time.
I mean, I think the micro-targeting stuff that Obama did in the last election on Facebook, we're going to try it in the European elections and in the 2015 general election. But then after that, everyone's going to be sick of it. Everyone's going to be sick of getting political messages. So it's interesting to see how much of a shelf life direct, targeted, automated messaging is going to have in this space.
Yeah, but the danger is thinking of any of this stuff as the apotheosis of online organizing tools rather than the first stage. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned from having started using networked communications with acoustic couplers in 1977, it's that the best thing that we have in our hands today will look dinosauric and laughable in 18 months.
Okay, we need to take some more
Roz
questions.
has got her hand up over there.
Oh, okay, hang on. There's one question here, but let's go with your question first, and then we'll have you next, and then if hopefully...
I'm thinking about Aaron Swartz and what happened to him, and the way that the crisis is getting worse. how do you think governments will go about using social media to target the people they need to victimise? We've seen people jailed or massively fined for stupid jokes. When do smart-ass comments become criminal?
Who wants to tackle that one? I guess
Well,
this is...
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it was the airport, the famous tweet where someone said, "Oh, I'm going to blow up the airport," and he got done for, they actually thought he was a suspected terrorist.
This is two problems. I think this is trying to apply old laws into new spaces without really working out how you're going to do it. And secondly, the problem of automated collection and extraction of data. So mass surveillance of data, then extracting out on the basis of keywords, removing any context. Everything about hate speech or everything about direct incitement, context is everything to understand the nature of those utterances, as we call them. And the minute you start using mass search terms and plucking things out, you lose all of that. And I think the problem is how existing laws, and it's the same with the Communications Data Bill, because the law that's under, it's called RIPA, was passed 12 years ago, and no one's quite sure how it really applies to the internet in the same way. And so that's the fundamental problem. I mean, I think that there is definitely a battle going on for the heart and soul of the internet at the moment, between those who think it's now such an important part of the public space that it has to come under the purview of national legislation or international, and those, especially the influential early infrastructure makers, and in fact many of the leaders of the big companies now, who think, no, it's not, it's sort of beyond your remit.
I think that in Aaron's case, the problem was prosecutorial discretion. It was the combination of the fact that we are de facto, all of us, guilty of something, and the deck being stacked in such a way that once you were accused, you were almost certain either to be found guilty or to plead guilty. So in the United States, 97% of the people who receive a federal indictment plead guilty. And so either that means that America has got like a fleet of psychic prosecutors who only get it wrong 3% of the time, or people are so afraid of being jammed into, what is ultimately a horrific prison system that's so overcrowded the Supreme Court has started ordering them to let people go because just being in jail is cruel and unusual punishment in America, that people plead out. And so here I think America is less prone to that historically. I think Britain has often had the idea that you could pass broadly applicable laws and then let sensible politicians and policemen figure out who they should be applied to, like the ASBO, and that we are now seeing, thanks to the drug wars and a few other things in the States, that's becoming the norm there too. And so I don't know that it's a networked communications thing. I think that it's a fundamental justice thing.
Can I say just something about political parties doing this as well, though? Because what I think you're going to see is a sort of new political tactic of trawling the historical data of opponents for dirt.
Yeah.
I mean, we've always done that. We've always been looking for dirt. But now all the dirt we've ever dished is online and available and accessible. So you've seen it already, going back through historic timelines to try to find something that someone said that was against the party line, that was particularly stupid when they were 15 or 16, and then them getting hounded out.
All of Edward Snowden's anime message board posts are now collected.
And I think about Paris Brown, the young police and crime commissioner, who was basically hounded out of her job for something she tweeted when she was 14. And there's a real danger, because living in a liberal society is essentially based on the premise that people change their minds. Otherwise, why do we live in a liberal society where we argue things out? And I'm really worried that can have quite a stultifying effect, having everything you've ever written thrown back in your face constantly.
But there's probably a shelf life of the impact that will have as well, I think, as more and more people are familiar with how Facebook works and what you put up on the internet. I think the nature of what counts as a political scandal is already changing because of changing cultural attitudes to privacy. So there's something that will be to be navigated there, I think, as well.
Okay, let's take your question.
Hi, it's really a question for Jamie, I think. You're talking about the English Defence League and Beppe Grillo, them being expert at managing Facebook and their campaigns online. Can you actually think of a UK MP who has done something similar and really used Facebook effectively, individually. I don't mean, the party.
Well, Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, you've probably got better examples actually, but Stella Creasy says that her campaign on loan sharks has been successful partly as a result of mobilising people on social media. The better example is George Galloway. I think it was George Galloway's election victory. Was it a year ago? Was it over a year ago? No, I think it was over a year ago now. Because it so confounded the pollsters, and one of the reasons was that he was connecting with so many people outside of the sort of established system. And he didn't have such a big party machine as the Labour Party did, who were expected to win that seat. So he's probably the best example. But I think in the next election, the 2015 election, you're going to see, we've already seen it over the last 10 years, more and more independent standing and getting more and more proportion of a greater proportion of the vote as a result of these things. In the last election, more MPs held on to more candidates held on to their deposits than at any time as a proportion since the war. So there's a sort of slow rumbling effect as well, and then I think you're seeing a couple of sort of sparky examples like George Galloway.
And as if to prove that all pirates dream of being admirals, Galloway is now calling for vast censorship on the internet.
Right, I think we've overrun already, so I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there. But thank you very much to my wonderful panel, and thank you all for listening.